Hi, everybody. I am Ruth Ware, and I am so delighted to welcome you all to this Barnes & Noble Midday Mystery Series, whether you are coming to us at midday, mid-afternoon, or like me, middle of the evening. I am the author of, well, some books, but let's be honest, we're not here to talk about me, but about the extraordinarily talented duo behind the new Jack Reacher novel, No Plan B, which I have read, and to say it is highly anticipated would be an understatement, and it lived up to every moment of that anticipation for me. The authors, Lee Child is the author of 26 New York Times best-selling Jack Reacher thrillers, with 17 having reached the #1 position, and the #1 best-selling complete Jack Reacher story collection, No Middle Name. Foreign rights in the Reacher series have sold in 100 territories. A native of England and a former television director, Lee Child lives in New York City and Wyoming. And Andrew Child, who also writes as Andrew Grant, is the author of Run, False Positive, False Friend, False Witness, Invisible, and Too Close to Home. Andrew Child and his wife, the novelist Tasha Alexander, live on a wildlife preserve in Wyoming. He is the #1 best-selling co-author of the Jack Reacher novels The Sentinel and Better Off Dead. Andrew and Lee, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, thank you, Ruth. It's really nice of you to do this, especially because it's late for you.
Oh, well, it's my complete pleasure. Now, I have read No Plan B. I was very lucky to get an advanced reading copy. It is the 27th installment of the Jack Reacher series, which is incredible. Can you start by telling readers a little bit more about what to expect from this installment of Jack's adventures?
Well, Andrew and I can certainly do that, but we don't want to give away too much suspense. But from the writing point of view, it was a question of, okay, what is the feel? What is the temperature? What do we see in terms of the story? And then it just took on a life of its own, like it used to be when I was writing alone. I'm not an outliner. I'm not a planner. For me, it's all about just do a great first scene and then scratch your head and think of, all right, what's the second scene? What's the third scene? And we really got that working. And I'll tell you something that interests me, just thinking about it this morning, ahead of this event, and we'll see what Andrew has to say about it. But it starts out in Colorado with an incident. A woman jumps underneath a bus and kills herself. That is what everybody sees, except for one passerby, Jack Reacher, who sees something different. That's how the story starts, and it ends up in Mississippi. And what really I thought of this morning, Colorado is dry, crisp sort of climate. Mississippi, hot, steamy, and damp. And is that significant in the story? You know, we use geography in a way that is sometimes subliminal. But thinking about the story this morning, I thought, you know, that is significant. It ends up in this fetid sort of atmosphere. And did we use geography deliberately there?
That's fascinating.
There's another aspect of that too, because Colorado, most places in Colorado are over a mile high. There's actually nowhere in the UK, even if you climb to the top of the tallest mountain, that it is as high from above sea level as just the main street in the little town that the story starts in. And we go from there to the banks of the Mississippi, which is essentially at sea level. So, you know, not only have you got the difference in the climate, but you're literally descending from somewhere high down into somewhere low when Reacher is homing in on the bad guys and getting ready to set things to rights.
Yeah, that fascinated me too, how it ends up in a closed world, essentially. And this is why I thought it was great that you're doing this conversation, Ruth, because you have the same thing. I mean, we are so fascinated by closed situations. And mystery fiction has been that way really for 100 years. And, you know, what is the appeal of that? What is so fascinating about penetrating or being in a closed society? Could be 5 people, could be 10, could be 100, but it is somehow secret. I think that's irresistible too.
I really love the sense of, I mean, like you, I don't want to give away too much about where the novel ends up, but I love the sense of claustrophobia that kind of builds in this book. And the final scenes are incredibly tense and incredibly claustrophobic. But I thought that it was so beautifully contrasted with the sense that you have of, you know, the great open skies and Reacher on the road and the landscape that you conjure up. And I wondered if you could both talk a little bit about that, about setting and about the fact that, you know, Reacher he's almost this kind of American folk hero in a way. You know, he's very much in that tradition of sort of John Wayne and kind of Clint Eastwood. And it seems to me that the books are as much about that as they are a sort of hymn to kind of small town America. I mean, and the cities as well, because a lot of them do take place in the cities, but place is such a strong part of your novels. And what interested me about that is the fact that you are both, as am I, British. And I wondered how you were both able to get under the skin of an American ex-military police officer so convincingly, and also convey what felt very convincingly to me anyway, the American landscape. Do you think that's easier to do as an outsider?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I do. I think that observing something through a foreigner's eyes, you know, you pick up on detail that people who have been born with it and who have been brought up with it take for granted because they've been seeing it every day. You know, I think being from being outsiders absolutely helps us because, you know, those things aren't something that have always been around for us. They're new to us, so that we see them in a different way. And in terms of the, you know, getting under the skin of a military person, not necessarily a military policeman, but, you know, our father was an ex-soldier, and you know, he hadn't been a soldier for a very long time by the time I was born, and yet he still acted like one. He still talked like one. You know, there were weird things when I was a little kid. If we were going on somewhere in the car, if we were going to our grandparents' house, I was never allowed anything like a toy or a book that wasn't in a sealed bag that you could grab at a moment's notice, because ingrained into him, he just knew that at any moment you might have to abandon your vehicle. So you could not have anything in that vehicle that you could not grab and go. You could never have. I used to be jealous of my friends, you know, they'd go places and their cars were full of, it was like a mobile toy box, you know, with stuff everywhere that you could play with and entertain yourself with. We could have none of that. It had to be that you could grab it and leave that vehicle instantly. Same way if we were going somewhere new, he would memorize the route the night before we left, because your map might be destroyed. You couldn't rely on having it with you. Things like that stayed with him constantly. You know, any piece of equipment had to be maintained so that it's no good having it if you can't use, you know, all of that stuff came from that experience he had, and some of it rubbed off on us.
That is pretty bleak for a 7-year-old, isn't it? To say, like, I'm sorry, you can't take anything with you. You've got to be ready to drop and run at any point. I love that, you know, then maybe that fed into Reacher's kind of pared back lifestyle, shall we say. I'd love to talk a little bit about the writing process. Lee, you were saying that, you know, this book springs very much from a kind of a scene where, you know, there's this very dramatic opening where someone falls underneath a bus and it looks like an accident, but of course Reacher sees it from a slightly different angle and he knows what's going on. What happens from that point onwards? Andrew, did you take that idea and run, or was it your original premise and then you hand over to Lee with the what if? How does the back and forth work between you?
Well, I got a bit spoiled by the previous book, Better Off Dead, because what we'd done with the first one we did together, extensive talking, for one special reason, was that with Andrew joining, what I wanted to do was to move Reacher a little bit into the current day when it came to technology, because, you know, Reacher started out 25 years ago, and when the technological landscape was completely different. In fact, I remember writing that first book, I'd heard of this strange thing called email, and I really didn't know what it was. And I had this vague sense that it was some academic thing that university people had, and maybe one professor could use it as a way of communicating with another professor. But that's all I knew about email. And in fact, in that book, it says with tremendous ceremony that somebody sent an email to somebody else. And so that was sort of in keeping with the times. But personally, I'm very behind the times. I mean, I was literally the last human ever to get a cell phone and all that kind of thing. And I think that readers appreciate it if the main character is a little behind the curve in terms of technology, because it keeps things familiar for people, and it means that no reader need feel inadequate if they're not as savvy as the protagonist. So I think it is a good thing to keep the character a little bit behind the curve, but Reacher was getting miles behind the curve. I mean, grotesquely behind it, to the point where he was almost dysfunctional with it. And so I remember talking with Andrew with the first book, The Sentinel, saying, we've got to nudge him into plausibility for the present day. So there was a lot of kind of talking with that book. And then I think in order to avoid talking about the second book, which was called Better Off Dead, Andrew secretly wrote the opening. And it was a stunning opening, just fabulous opening. And so I was able to say, this is wonderful, you know, let's just carry on. So for this book, No Plan B, I was secretly hoping he was going to do the same thing, because that gets the first hurdle out of the way. And he did more or less, but there was a lot of talking. But mainly the thing that really I loved about No Plan B was that it is exactly the Reacher method. That there was no, the title is No Plan B, and for our method, you could just leave off the B, no plan. It was about find that opening scene and then just see what happens, and which is a horrendous way to work. Most writers don't like that because it is so difficult to, it's vulnerable. It is, you've got absolutely no, it's like climbing a mountain without that safety rope attached to you. And I'm very comfortable with it because that's how I've always worked. And Andrew's not a huge outliner, but he was always a little less comfortable with it until No Plan B, where it just happened in exactly an organic way, like it always did in the past. And so we had a blast with it, really.
Is that how you saw it, Andrew? Or were you sort of secretly thinking one step ahead, but keeping it to yourself, which is what I would have done?
Well, that's pretty much what I did when we were writing The Sentinel, because, you know, I'd heard Lee say, you know, numerous times that about not planning and whatever, and I thought, well, you know, he must secretly plan. You know, it must just be, you know, the image that he wants to portray. So I assumed there was a plan somewhere. So I figured I probably should have one too. And I remember when it came home to roost, because we'd finished a scene, we decided we were happy with it, we were ready to move on. So I remember saying, okay, so what happens next? And he said, well, I don't know. And I was panic stricken. I was, what do you mean you don't know? You must know. How are we going to know what to write next? So what I realized was that really it's not a question of there being no plan. It's a question of the plan, instead of it all being done in one big chunk up front, which then for some people, I think, can become a safety rope. It can also become, you know, a millstone around your neck, because it's something that you spend a lot of time on, that you kind of wind up committed to. And the thing with it is if you think of it more as a map than anything else, if each turn on that map, which seems fine at the beginning when you're looking down at it from a big height, and you're not going to be using some of it for weeks or months, you know, it might look fine. But if each turn is 1 degree off, you know, too little and to notice at the beginning, if each one is 1 degree off, by the time you're halfway through, you might be 90 degrees off. By the time you're finished, you might be 180 degrees off, and you're committed to going in this wrong direction. So I can absolutely see the value of it. It was just a painful transition from what I was used to. And so, yeah, I did sort of, with the first one, try to kind of secretly, like, prepare, I didn't want to be caught short. I didn't want to be the one who didn't have any more ideas, so I was trying to prepare some in advance. They were all wrong. They were all completely pointless and useless. So by the second book, I'd learned, I was, creeping up that rock face a little bit more confidently. But by this one, yeah, it was just a question of how do we want the book to start? And we decided on this idea of a tragic incident where it really kind of encapsulates Reacher, doesn't it? Just in one little episode, something happens, it's bad. He's the only one that sees it. He's the only one that is clear-sighted and analyzes it correctly. And then when no one else is going to do anything about it, because he's in no rush, he's living his own life. It's only when no one else is going to do anything that he figures, well, in that case, it's down to me. So he steps in and he makes things right. So that led us to all of the questions. Okay, we've got that opening scene. What happens next? Where does Reacher go? What does he do? What do the bad guys do? And we just figure it out as we go. And it actually, once you're used to it, becomes, really exciting.
Well, one of the things that I loved about the books was, I did feel that it really epitomized Reacher's kind of moral code, because he is someone who just, he can't let a wrong thing slide. There's no reason for him to get involved in this. He's a bystander. In some senses, it's none of his business. He could just carry on about his day, but he doesn't. He knows there's a wrong and he has to right it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about, Reacher's, what drives Reacher to right wrongs all the way, and do you think that his moral code has been a constant over the 27 books, or do you see him changing a bit as time goes on? I'd love to get both of your perspectives on that.
Well, I always feel that the character exists, absolutely. He is who he is, but fundamentally the point of a character is to satisfy the reader. And, as you said, we've been fortunate enough to do 27 Reacher books. But if there was nothing in Reacher that resonated with readers, it would have been one or two before it faded away. And so I think the more interesting question is, what does the reader want? And how does a book satisfy the reader? And my opinion is, even though I'm a terribly cynical old guy now, my opinion is that really, most people, most of the time, in America, in Britain, wherever, most people are decent. They want to do the right thing. They have a notion of goodwill and kindness in their mind. And their natural instinct as human beings is to do the decent thing. But in real life, they can't. Almost never can you do the right thing. If you're walking home and you see some guy slap his girlfriend on a street corner, really, what are you going to do? You're physically intimidated, you're possibly legally intimidated, you're just overwhelmed by the situation. There's really nothing you can do. Or if you see somebody getting bullied at work, what are you going to do, really? You'll get yourself into trouble. You'll be a troublemaker. It might come back on you. Every single situation that people find themselves in, there's always something that stops them from doing what they want to do. Deep down, their instinct is to defend that girlfriend or to defend the person getting bullied at work, but they can't. And so they turn to fiction. Fiction is for what you don't get in real life. And so they thrill and exhilarate, and they're shoulder to shoulder with Reacher, because Reacher is doing what they want to do. If you were on a street corner in Colorado and you saw a situation where maybe somebody pushed somebody, really, what are you going to do about it? You want to help. You want to find justice, but you can't. So you turn to the book, and sure, Reacher is going to do it. As you see in the book, Reacher will not let it go. He travels the entire length of the country into a hellhole in order to put it right. And I think the reader loves that. And so the moral code really belongs to the reader. It is, the character is acting it out for them like a proxy. And I think that's what people value so much.
Lee, I love that answer, and I don't think that's the answer of a cynic at all. In fact, you have me tearing up there the idea that, you know, that everybody wants to do the right thing. Andrew, do you agree with that?
Absolutely, I do. And, you know, the Times in both of our countries recently have, you know, there have been aspects of them that have been very worrying, very depressing. And I was interested to see how that would be reflected in people's attitudes to Reacher. You know, I was thinking, well, if we're kind of going back to a sort of 1980s greed is good type environment, does that mean people will turn their back on the, you know, the lone hero who stakes everything to do the right thing? But actually, we're seeing the opposite. And what that says to me is that it's a very hopeful message. You know, it shows that despite the times we live in, people are just as keen, if not even more keen than ever, to do, if they can't do the right thing themselves, at least to see the right thing being done. And you know, that's for me been a real one of the sort of few encouraging things about the kind of, you know, social and political landscape that we've seen emerge over the last few years.
And the other half of that there is, and I noticed a question from one of the audience about this. If Reacher is such a good guy with such an impeccable moral compass, why does he murder so many people?
There is that. That's a valid question.
It is a valid question. And the answer falls into two parts, really. First of all, again, secretly, the reader, I mean, readers as a whole are the most civilized people. You know, people that are prepared to devote a chunk of their life to reading are usually the best informed and the most intelligent members of our community. And so, in reality, they completely understand that obviously there should be fair trials, there should be legitimate arrests, there should be rights, certainly for the victim, but also for the accused. There've got to be all those rules and all of that kind of thing, technicalities here and there. They understand that perfectly, but it frustrates them like mad because, you know, some people just need shooting in the head. They feel that even though they would never do it. They don't think of a Reacher book as a textbook for how you should live. It is about that little burst of primeval satisfaction when a thoroughly bad guy gets dispatched. So that's part of the reason that it satisfies an atavistic thought in all our heads. Every single person has got a list of 10 people they would cheerfully walk up and shoot in the head. Everybody has. I know that. Even though that people are far too civilized to admit it, I know that they do. So that gives them what they want as well. And also, it's a kind of metaphor, because if we didn't do the brutal justice thing, then after writing No Plan B, we'd have had to write a supplementary book, a legal thriller about the trial. And so in a way, the dispatch of the bad guys at the end is a metaphor. You can see it as a metaphor for justice done. And of course, in real life, we need to have trials and all that kind of thing. And we need to accept that sometimes guilty people will get off on a technicality. We understand that. That's the price of civilization. But fiction is different. We can let our wildest dreams run free.
I love the idea that basically Reacher's killing sprees are just an excuse so you don't have to write the subsequent courtroom drama. I'm not going to research that. Now, I'm going to turn over to the audience questions in a minute because we have a ton, some on screen and some pre-submitted, which are great. But I have one more question for you before I do that. I'm sure both of you have been asked before, you know, what books you're reading and what you would recommend. But my question is, Reacher is obviously a really intelligent guy. He's very well informed. We've already established that, you know, he's a latecomer to the mobile phone, which makes me think he must be a reader or must have been a reader at some point in his life. So I would love to know, what book would each of you recommend to Reacher? And do you think he would have room for a paperback in his pocket beside his folding toothbrush?
Well, yes, I mean, and it's almost a serious point. I've many times had Reacher read a book, but he finds them. And there is, in fact, a sort of unofficial economy of used paperbacks that you find left on a bus or in a motel room. Some motel rooms have a little thing in the lobby where you can, leave a book, take a book. Those battered, furry old paperbacks show up everywhere, and they're a sort of unofficial economy. And that's what Richa reads from. And yes, he would probably carry one in his pocket if he hadn't finished it yet. But what book would I give him to read? He's such a weird guy in terms of his tastes and interests. I would probably have him read something about Neanderthal anthropology, or something, that he doesn't know already that he would be fascinated about.
What about you, Andrew? What would you recommend to Richa?
Well, I totally agree with the point about Richa's reading being informed really by what he can find, because, he's not the kind of guy who is going to have a card for his local library or, a membership at his local Barnes and Noble, because he doesn't have those things. So, either it'll be he's passing a bookshop and happens to go in, or he finds a book somewhere, And similarly, I've always been fascinated by books that I've seen left, because people leave them because they're thinking this is such a brilliant book that I want to share it with the next random stranger who comes to this hotel or gets on this train or whatever. Or did they hate it and think it was so bad I don't want to even carry it home? I'm fascinated by that. But I think with Richa, we've talked about Richa being all about doing the right thing, making the future better than the past. And I always think about that old expression that those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. So I think that I would have Richa reading it doesn't necessarily have to be fiction, it could be non-fiction, something set not in perhaps as far back in history as Lee was suggesting, but something maybe back in the 17th, 18th century, when again there was a lot of turmoil and a lot of dissatisfaction amongst the population and a lot of tension between different countries. I think I'd see him reading something there that perhaps would help to set us on the right course today.
I love that. What brilliant answers. I agree. I see Richa as a historian. Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the audience questions. We have some in the Q&A section and some that were pre-submitted. So I'm going to go first of all to some of the pre-submitted ones. Okay, Kathleen Brown asks, she says, I'm fairly new to the series and I've read over half the book so far. I enjoy them immensely, but I'm curious as to how a British author is able to create such an authentic American soldiers. Do you have or know any personal US soldiers as inspiration?
Well, in a sort of backward way, I do now, but I didn't at the beginning. And I based it on, extensive contact with the US. I first went to the US in 1974. And it was more than 20 years later before I started writing Killing Floor. And then the year after I did Killing Floor, I emigrated to the US. And part of the emigration process is a lot of bizarre requirements. You've got to, when you show up at the border, you've got to be holding in your hand an X-ray of your chest to prove you don't have tuberculosis. A lot of weird stuff you've got to do. And one of the things you do is list all your previous visits so they can check police department records to make sure you haven't been causing mayhem everywhere you've gone. And so 24 years after my first visit is when we immigrated. And I listed all my previous visits, which added up to 100. So I knew the States from the outsider's point of view very well by that point. And in terms of the soldier thing, like Andrew said, our dad gave us a window into the military mentality. He was fundamentally a civilian, a very normal, respectable, responsible member of society. And I think part of his fascination was how different the military universe is from the civilian universe. He was doing things in the military as this super respectable person that would be frankly unacceptable in civilian society. And so he was fascinated by that duality. And so was I to a certain extent. And I've read endless history about, recent wars and ancient wars and soldiers going all the way back to the Romans. And the perspective you get from that is that there really isn't any difference. The experience of a soldier in the Roman army is really not all that different to the current experience. And so you feel your way into it like that. And the military police thing, in fact, our dad remembered nothing about the military police, except that they were the ones that jumped out of a Jeep outside a bar and hit you all over the head with a stick. That's basically what he remembered. But I figured that you've got a town, whatever it may be, could be a huge city, could be a small town, and there's a police department. And the police department is presumably capable of policing the population that it's among. And so I thought, okay, the same principle applied to the army. The army is full of these trained killers, and therefore to manage them, the police department must be super tough. So that was my conceit for research. And since then, it happened all backward, because now I've met hundreds of thousands of soldiers because of the series. I get invited to places and meet the real people. And it's a huge universe, the military. And therefore we can get away with stuff, because sometimes I've asked them directly, I've said, is this even remotely plausible? And they say, well, no, not in my unit, but I assume it's like that in some other unit.
And it could happen in some unit somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that you might both have a different answer for this one. So I'm going to ask Andrew first, and then Lee, see if you've got a different answer. Abina Duncan would like to know, what was your hardest scene to write in No Plan B, and why?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, depends on how you define hardest, I think, because I don't know how you find this, Ruth, but one thing that I learned when I started writing, I had these assumptions that I'd made. I'd thought, okay, the difficult scenes to write are going to be the chaotic ones where there's lots of action, there's lots of fight, and the normal scenes are going to be easier. And it turned out to be completely the other way around. If you are writing a scene about somebody breaking into a bank or stealing a car or jumping out of an airplane, that's great. There's tons of material to use. The things that are actually really difficult are when you've got to move your character from one room to another room, because how many different ways are there to say that he opened the door and walked through, So in some ways, those dull scenes are the most difficult. But in No Plan B, towards the end, we have Reacher where he has to get into a really, really difficult situation, and then he has to get back out again. And I think probably the combination of those scenes, the getting in and the getting back out, were the most difficult, because you got a lot of technical stuff there, you've got a lot of emotional stuff there. How are the people he's interacting with in this place feeling? How would they respond? How would they react when he told them to do things that they might not want to do? So I guess that was probably certainly the biggest challenge, were those scenes at the very end.
Yeah,
Lee,
I
what
mean,
would
my
your
answer
answer
will be similar to that. It's just the words in my head. A scene is easy because it's sort of, if you think of it as a scene, you already have a conception of what needs to happen and how is it going to go. It's the bits in between the scenes, like Andrew said, that are the hardest part. The daily normal stuff, getting up, taking a shower, having breakfast. What do you do about that? Do you compress it into a line or two? Do you ignore it? Do you make a feature of it? What do you do with the little bits in between? And I have a sort of rule or maxim. I say to myself, write the fast parts slow and the slow parts fast. And so, yeah, we can luxuriate in details. The break in and the break out that Andrew's talking about at the end, there's a huge temptation to go back in the manuscript and change the geography or change the technology a little bit so it's easier when you're doing that scene. But we never do that, and I've never done that. I set it up, and if it's impossible to deal with, that's not my problem. That's Reach's problem, and he has to figure his way through it, which he does, and that makes it all the better scene. But yeah, I would say, it's a bit of an evasive answer, but the scenes are easy to write. It's the bit between the scenes that are the hard part.
I think that's so true. And also just keeping the routine stuff interesting is the challenge. Like a cool scene is a cool scene, but if you've got to convey a boring part or a certain amount of information, you have to justify it, there being a reason for it. I'm going to take a question from the Q&A section, and I just want to remind the audience, I've seen a few questions come up in chat, but I won't see them unless they're in the Q&A section. So if you have a question, please post it under the Q&A tab, which is just to the right. So Trevor Johnston has asked, with you being more of a discovery writer rather than a plotter, how do you maintain continuity around your characters so well? I would love to know this. Do you have like a big Bible, or do you have, like George R.R. Martin has devoted fans who tell him where he slipped up?
Well,
bit of both.
We certainly have the fans who tell us if we screwed up, and but of course you can reverse that and ask the fans if there's something we don't remember. They will, and that helps. I think in general, I would plead not guilty to doing a lot of great continuity. I mean, I've screwed it up many times. In the early half dozen books, I think it carries on up to about book number 8. I had a sequence of Reach's promotions. After he left West Point, he ended up major, but his sequence of promotions was kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back at one point. That it was a complete mistake on my part. But I turned it into part of the storyline for The Enemy, which was the 8th book. It's about, it's a prequel set while he was in the army, and he solves the case, but with a lot of mayhem on the margins. And because of that, he gets demoted. And so really that was a way of accommodating a mistake I'd made, but it looked like, my God, this guy's a planner. He planned this 8 books ahead.
I love that. Andrew, what about, I imagine the, having to take on such an enormous library of things that had already happened. How did you approach that? Did you sit down and make a list of events and characters, or?
I actually did, yeah. I mean, obviously, when each book came out, each of the 24 that Lee had written before I joined in, I'd obviously read them all when they came out, read some of them again for fun later. But then when I thought, right, I've got to take this seriously now. In the gap between when we first floated the idea and then when we started writing the Sentinel, I went back, I reread all of them, and I put together a spreadsheet with, I can't even remember how many columns, dozens of columns with all kinds of stuff in there, because I knew that it was less likely to be back, the back of my mind, the little details that Lee would remember. So I haven't done that since. I haven't done that for the 3 that we've done together. But for the first 24, yeah, I've got this extensive document that tells me everything about where they're set, first person or third person, when Reacher appears in the story, how he appears in the story, what the key fights are, what kind of weapons are used, what kinds of cars are used, where the locations, primary, supplementary, all kinds of stuff is in there. So, I try to, to be as conscientious as possible with that kind of thing.
But all that said, and I'm sure you would agree, Ruth, is that when you're writing a book, you're essentially living with a real person, and you know them as much as you would know a friend. And if you do a series that runs, more than 20 books, that big person becomes very familiar. So in a way, he's like an extra brother for Andrew and me. He's, we're not crazy. We know he's not real, but we've lived with him for so long, he is kind of real. And so, but I'm glad Andrew did the spreadsheet, because that refreshes my memory apart from anything else.
Another question from the chat, from Tara Capobianco. I hope I said that right, Tara. I'd love to know, do either of you have a favourite Reacher book?
Well,
are you allowed to pick one, or is it a bit like saying, you know, which of your children are your favourite?
well, we both know through bitter experience that parents have favorite children and unfavorite children. And so, you know, there's no inhibition about saying so. For me personally, I Killing Floor will always be a sentimental favorite because it was the first one. It was
your baby.
Started the whole ball rolling. But generally speaking, what I say is my favorite is the next one, because honestly, we try our best. We do the best book we possibly can, but no book is ever as good as it could be or as you hoped it might be. It just never is. And so the one that you haven't screwed up yet could be the favorite. That's how I
feel that. Andrew, what's your answer?
Yeah, I mean, I love the bit about the next one, you know, and the next one is still, you know, new enough that, you know, maybe that will be the perfect, you know, flawless, you know, ultimate book. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. But I think for me, I want to cheat. I want to say two books.
That's allowed.
One of them being Killing Floor, because it is the one that got everything going. But for me, more than that, it's my memory of how I felt before I started to read it and when I'd finished reading it, because, you know, back then, things were very different. I actually had a good job in those days, and Lee was out of work. You know, he was worried about how was he going to pay his mortgage, how was he going to feed his family, and so he took the incredibly sensible step of deciding to do those things by writing books.
Becoming a novelist.
Yeah. So because I was the one in the family who, you know, he could rely on and who, you know, actually read some books, he sent it to me to look at to see if it was going to be any good. And I remember thinking, this is just the worst thing in the world, because what if it isn't?
What if I hate it?
Not only do I have to phone him up and tell him that it's terrible, but then I've got to, well, do I then have to, you know, send him food parcels and things like that until he finds another job? So, you know, I will never forget the trepidation starting to read it. And, you know, the flip side to that is I will also never forget just the relief and the joy that came from seeing how good that book was. It was unbelievable. Then we went through this crazy few years where, you know, I would be going around like an evangelist, you know, saying to everybody I knew, my brother's book's come out, you've got to buy it. And they'd be like, Lee, what? That sounds a bit weird. Oh, I don't know. You know, no one would know, you know. And then if you fast forwarded a few years, you know, I dreaded the run up to Christmas or anything like that, because everybody I knew would be getting in touch saying, oh, could you get my girlfriend's hairdresser's cat sitter is Lee's biggest fan, you know, could you get me a signed copy? You know, it happened all the time. So you know, that completely changed. So yeah, Killing Floor for those reasons. And the other one, to be a bit more serious about it, is I would say Make Me would be the other one that I would pick out, because over the years, I think, you know, there's an expression in literature that it says that easy reading is difficult writing. And it used to drive me crazy when I would see in some of the kind of literary type journals and things, they would always be super dismissive of the new Reacher book. They'd say, well, sure enough, you know, you pick it up and you read the first sentence and then you can't put it down and you have to stay up all night and you have to finish reading it, and there's just no way that you can ever put it down. It's so propulsive and so brilliant. But hey, you know, it's genre fiction, so obviously no good, you know. And it used to drive me crazy, because the reason that happened was it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. It happened because Lee put so much time and so much effort into picking every single one of the words that went into that book specifically for the function that it played. It was a machine. It was like a Swiss watch. It was completely designed to grab you at the beginning and not let you go. And I personally felt, you know, looking out for my brother, that he just didn't get the credit that he deserved. And I think that if you take Make Me, not only does it have all of the Reacher trademarks, you know, the little town, the complicated mystery. Reach is solving it step by step, you know, tons of violence, tons of intrigue and mystery, all fantastic stuff, but it just took the prose to a whole extra level. You know, there are expressions, there are descriptions. I remember one of the sun rising over the corn in a cornfield. You know, there are things in there that I swear you could take out, and you know, the literary fellows would be fighting over trying to claim some of those things. So I would say Make Me is the other one I would pick out.
I love that, and I think there will be a lot of crime and thriller and genre writers generally out there doing the Breakfast Club fist bump to that. Now we are very sadly almost out of time, so I'm going to selfishly steal the last question and ask you both, what is next? Are you working on anything? Lee, I think you're an executive producer for the Amazon series. Is anything exciting happening on that? Tell me what's happening next for you both.
Well, another Reacher book next year, which, you know, my ritual was always to start on the 1st of September. And so, you know, Andrew very graciously is participating in that. He's starting the 1st of September. And so the new one is underway. 1 year from now, we'll be talking.
Nice to hear.
Can't talk about it now because we haven't finished it yet. Therefore, we've no idea what it's about or anything. But that's underway. Amazon season 2 is shooting now, and I'll be going up there in a week or two to say hello and see how they're doing. Yeah, it's just rolling along.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
they haven't let me near the TV yet, unfortunately. I'm still hoping for you know, that little cameo in one of the seasons. But
who would you want to be, Andrew, if you could choose your cameo? Maybe, you know, a homeless person, or a kind of a duke swaggering across the
I think, you know, just some fella sat at the end of a bar somewhere. I think that would work for me. Or, you know, sitting on a bench somewhere, that would be fine. But yeah, no, all my energy is going into the next Reacher. We started on September 1st, as Lee said. We've had a little bit of time out with the promotion for No Plan B. I was just over in Arizona doing an event there, and so, you know, next week or so is busy with that kind of thing. But as soon as we close the book on the promotion side, then it's just going to be, you know, locked away doing nothing until the new Reacher is finished.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for coming along, and I want to thank Lee and Andrew for their fascinating insights into Reacher's world, and thank you to everybody who came and watched and took part and asked questions. I know I've been completely gripped for this whole hour, so thank you both so much. Some couple of business things. If you have a ticket that includes a signed copy of No Plan B, that will be delivered to you in 8 to 10 business days. If you didn't get a ticket that includes a book, but you would like a copy, or maybe you just want 2 copies, then copies are of course available 24/7 on barnesandnoble.com or in your local store. So it only remains for me to say thank you again so much, Lee and Andrew. I've had an absolute blast, and this has been a fascinating hour of insight into your process.
Well, thank you, Ruth. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, you've done a fantastic job of hosting us. Thank you for that, and a huge thank you to everybody who took time out of their day to join us. So we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again next year.
Good night, everybody.